Hello and welcome. His effort to bring together nations in fair trading has posed something of a challenge, but he persists in pushing for a global system that will help developing nations compete with the industrialized world. This week on 101, meet the former New Zealand Prime Minister and World Trade Organization Director General, Mike Moore. It was an unexpected jump into the highest levels of office for someone who'd come from a tough working-class neighbourhood and started out as a labourer. Mike Moore's activism came early on, taking him into leading positions in the trade unions and making him the country's youngest Member of Parliament. Moore says he discovered capitalism late in life and is now focused on lifting the poorest communities in the world to a higher, sustainable level. Mike, it's a real delight to talk with you.
Yeah, nice to see you again.
Likewise. How do you feel about that description of people saying you're the human face of globalization?
Oh, it's a terrible thought. Yeah, Clinton said that. I said, every time I get up in the morning and shave and look in the mirror and think, if I'm the human face of globalization, we're in deep trouble here. I've been called worse than a human face.
But in the last decade, of the 20th century and the start of this new millennium, there's been so much change in the world. I mean, from the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com bubble, the dot-com boom before that, the rise of Chinese economic might, and so on. With the recession, which then turned into what people were fearing would be a depression, and maybe there's an optimism of coming out of that. So what do you think that tells us about the way countries are approaching the global economy? Is it more interlinked than ever, or is it that people are going in different directions?
I think it's more integrated, and it's a good thing. In the main, we've created more wealth in the last 60 years than the rest of history put together. It's stunning. And the last decade have been the most successful in human history in terms of growth. And there are a lot of people writing, saying globalization's dead, it's the end of the world, Great Depression, a bit premature. What is deglobalization? That's a recession. Deglobalization is a Great Depression. And I have always thought and argued that globalization is not a policy. We didn't sort of make it up in Wellington or DC or London. It's a process, and it's been going on ever since man looked over the horizon and dreamed. And it can't be stopped any more than you can stop people thinking.
Now, I'm going to trace it back to where your roots come into how you ended up where you are. And you were born in New Zealand in Wakatane, if I'm saying it correctly.
I believe so.
Yeah, and then you were raised, and you were born there, just a couple of years after the end of the Second World War, and you were raised there in Kawakawa. What were those early years like? What was New Zealand like at that time?
I come from a very strange background, I'm working class, sort of white trash from the far north. I was in the meatworks at 14, and so it was pretty rugged. And I was one of the few white guys. I can remember praying, God, why'd you make me white? Why couldn't I be like everybody else? So I have a rural sort of working class background. It was a curious society post-war in New Zealand. We had perfected the welfare state in many ways. I remember when I was on the construction sites, the boss ringing up and saying, look, Mike, will you get the boys to come to work? I said, nah, we're going to the football. There was full employment. You couldn't buy much in the shops. There was very little competition. It was all steak and 3 veggies, except for the Chinese bloke down the road. Very insular society.
What sort of relationship did you have with your mother and father? I know they were long-serving members of the Labour Party, and you always said that you didn't join the Labour Party, you were born into it.
I was born in the Labour. My father died when I was about 6. My mother remarried badly, as you do. But we were basically a Labour movement, trade union, Labour Party. And my mother, we had a major industrial dispute. We called it a lockout. Others called it a strike in '51, and I remember reading my mother saying she was pushing prams around with leaflets, and I was in the pram leaflets on top, backing the strikers, because it was illegal to support the strikers. They passed legislation. You went to feed those are the boys who were locked down. So it was core Labour identity and tribal in many ways.
Yeah, and you dropped out of boarding school to go, as you say, work in the slaughterhouse, and then you were doing labour work, and then as a printer and stuff. Was it a tough time for you?
Not really. You see, I think when you look back at having holes in the floor and water draining out, and long drop toilets, the thing is, everybody was like that. It wasn't as though we're the only people in town. It was very tough for women, very tough to be a woman in New Zealand in this time when the men drank too much, they used their fists too much. Women were not supposed to work. If somebody's wife was working, that meant he wasn't a very good husband. And we had a thing called 6 o'clock closing. The pubs would close at 6 as a wartime regulation that stayed in for 20 or 30 years. And it became a pretty violent, dark side of New Zealand in those days that we don't talk too much about.
How did it shape you as a young man? How did it affect you? What vestiges of that time stay with you now?
I've always hated privilege. I hate privilege, and I hate bullies. And because I had bad legs and things, I wasn't that good at sport. And the one thing I did have was books and to read history. I'd be the only guy who wouldn't go to school because I was reading a very good, interesting book. Why go to school? And I think that triggered, I think, love of books, love of ideas, love of a good argument, sort of Irish culture too, dark Irish, you know, the boss, and the privileged.
I presume, I mean, you know, that time, as you say, rural environment, quite poor in areas, you know, there wasn't a lot to do. So, I mean, you found something, actually, that maybe others didn't have.
Yeah, but, you know, there are friends and that, fishing, shooting, it was very rural kind of small town life. But drink and cars were the dangerous thing. I mean, there weren't so many cars, and they were bigger, stronger, and weren't quite so fast. But there was a dark side to this, which we shouldn't really dwell on. I mean, in many ways, we're very lucky. I mean, I keep thinking, you know, to be the poorest person in New Zealand puts you in the top 1% of the world. You know, and if you're going to be poor, you pray to God you're poor in a place like New Zealand.
It seemed like you drifted around a bit from job to job. Was that the case? I mean, did you have a career path in mind? Did you have an idea of what you wanted to do?
Not really. I was involved. I was a political activist very young, so I was involved in the anti-war movement, the anti-apartheid movement. My family was a bit unusual, so I was out of home very early, and on the sites very early, and had a lot of friends in the trade union and labour movement. They became, in a way, family. And I was brought up at the knee of some of the, you know, I met a lot of the old heroes of the early days of the labour movement in my country.
Didn't you get to spend much time with your mother and your
Not as
stepfather?
my father passed away,
Right, with your stepfather
and
and
mother
stuff.
had a couple of other sons, and things were pretty hard for them out there struggling away, battling away.
Yeah, by 17, you were an active trade unionist. You were actually out there working, and you were elected to the Auckland's Trades Council. I mean, at a very young age there.
Yeah, well, that was a story, and that where everyone was on the grog, and the meeting was dragging on. If you put the nomination at the last minute, another vote would take an hour so you get in. In Printers Union, you called them Fathers of the Chapel. Isn't that lovely? Because the union in the old country used to meet in the church because it was illegal to have union meetings.
What drew you to politics, though? Was there anything particular that said to you, this is the kind of, you know, career I could do well with, or kind of activity that I
like to think I was not a careerist. Perhaps I was. I like to think I wasn't. It is the cause, and it is about social justice and these cliches. There was the Vietnam War. We had not the draft in New Zealand, but we're getting close to it. There was the issues of apartheid. Here's something that New Zealanders should be ashamed of. Apartheid was evil enough. Now, our natural religion really is the All Blacks and rugby. Here's the deal. Imagine this. South Africa would not have any blacks in its team, but it told New Zealand, you cannot have any Maori or Indigenous people in your team. And New Zealand put up with that for about 20 years. Can you believe it? And as a schoolboy, we're out there with pamphlets, no Maoris, no tour. we will decide who a New Zealander is, not South Africa. And this was not popular. And then we escalated that when I was a young member of Parliament until the South Africans changed the racial selection of their team, no tour at all. This was not popular with working class people because, you know, rugby is, well, it's more than a religion, isn't it?
Did you have mentors at the time, though? Were there people who really helped guide you?
Yes, I did. The wonderful thing about the Labour movement in those days was the joy the old guys had of finding new young people coming in, because there'd been a gap. There'd been all these guys from the 30s, then there's the war, and it took really the politicisation of the 60s and 70s to bring a new generation, and they were very generous and big people. We had a leader called Norman Kirk who died young in office. He was a great man, great compassionate man, and these were my heroes. And my heroes were in the books and in the poems. And since then I've met a lot of my modern heroes. So it's been great, you know.
I've got many more questions for you, Mike. Stand by. We're going to do more one-on-one with Mike Moore in just a moment. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching One-on-One. We're speaking with Mike Moore, the former WTO Director General and former Prime Minister of New Zealand. You became a member of Parliament, actually, of Eden, for Eden, in 1972, and you were only like, what, 23 years old, the youngest ever elected.
They should have made me Prime Minister then. I knew everything. There was nothing I didn't know at 23.
Well, I was going to say, you had an early start in politics. Did you feel at all, I mean, really ready for your responsibility?
Yes, but looking back on it, of course not. I then swiftly became the youngest Member of Parliament ever defeated. And 3 years later, woof, we're all out. I'd applied for overseas volunteer service overseas, VSA, which is Peace Corps. I got turned down, so I stood for Parliament and won. Could have been a lot different.
And it was only a couple of years later. You were still a young man in your early 20s, and you got married. Was your wife able to cope, young wife able to cope with a sort of young politician running around?
Yeah, well, she knew what she was getting into, I think, and so she, you know, it was always a hell of a lot of fun. But it was a different age. I mean, we didn't have any money, didn't care, took risks, stood for things that were important, in a way relished the abuse of the right and people. There was nothing we weren't going to do. We build a new world, and to hell with it, you know.
But things really started to move for you once you became the Minister for Overseas Trade, and your involvement began with the GATT negotiations in the 1980s. Now, to what extent did you feel that was a turning point?
I was an economic nationalist and protectionist up until about 79, and we were negotiating a free trade agreement with Australia, and I went into it in depth, and I realised that economic integration was the way to go. And there's a very good report written by the Commonwealth on poverty reduction for developing countries through trade, and that changed my mind on a number of economic things, and realising that economic integration is a pathway to peace and security and will lift our living standards. So curiously, in New Zealand, the Labour movement was internationalist in foreign policy, but not in economic policy. And if I've done anything for the movement, was to talk to them about being internationalist in economic policy. If we didn't use that word globalization, but use the word internationalism, it'd probably go down a lot better with the centre-left.
You held a number of ministerial posts, and for a while there was a stint between 1988 and 1990. You were the New Zealand Minister for the America's Cup.
So much fun. Half an hour a week, a budget of 100,000, and a lot of serious adult business people came in. This helped change New Zealand, by the way. This coincided with port reform. We used to take 10 days to turn a ship around. We got it down to 1 day, but all that beautiful land downtown was open for development and 24-hour shopping and all that. And the business guys had a very big go at it. It took them a while to win it. I wasn't minister when we won it, but it was mainly changing regulations, opening taxis. It was a bit of a Trojan horse for economic change. And of course, I'd be just up to Russell Heimer. We were meeting with His Highness the America's Cup there. skippers of both boats are Kiwis. It's deep in our DNA as New Zealanders now, this, and a lot of the technology and ideas, and now the yacht building industry, which was almost zippers, probably $500 million, and it's good money, and it's a lot of fun.
Well, it's interesting. In 1990, you became leader of the Labour Party. Soon enough, sure enough, you became Prime Minister for about 8 weeks when Geoffrey Palmer resigned.
I'm shortest serving Prime Minister in New Zealand's history.
How frustrating was it? Because, of course, Labour Party didn't get elected, after that.
We're adults. We knew what was happening. We were 25% behind in the polls. The question was, could we lose with a bit of dignity and direction and get ourselves back within 3-6 years. We could have been third party, and I was haunted by the Canadians, where the governing party had gone down to about 4 seats. We were not liked, and I resisted taking the leadership for a while, and then I thought, look, we're in trouble here. So in a strange way, it was quite one of the more selfless things I've done.
You thought about breaking away and creating a separate party for the 1996 election then, but then decided against that. Why?
Because I thought the party had evened up a bit. What was happening, where there was talks of undoing our economic reforms, becoming protectionist, taking the personal tax up again, and going through all the policies that had failed my country for 20 or 30 years. And the show came right. This was all talk. I was rolled as leader. That's this happens from time to time. I hate it when it happens, but it does. But it was dressed up as some sort of philosophic thing, which it actually wasn't. It was a power play, as you have power plays.
Of course, a turning point for you, or at least a defining moment for you, was when in 1999 you ran for Director General of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and you ended up striking a deal where you only served half of the 6-year term. What was the story behind that?
Well, there are 3 criteria, because you can't have a vote. Otherwise, the Caribs and the Pacific Islanders will decide, and Africa will decide. So there's 3 criteria: volume, meaning number; depth, meaning trade, weight; and the last was distribution, which means distribution. I won on all 3, clear cut, bang, won. But because it's a consensus-based organisation, the losers people can veto the winner, and I would have lost, although winning on all criteria. Super Chai would have been out, and in would have come a third person, which is what some of them were working for. I decided that I'd cut a deal and take half and give the other bloke who lost half. Pretty opportunist, but if there's a deal to be done, I did it. Being right or wrong, did it.
But you headed up the WTO at a very interesting time. Of course, it was in world economics. It went from that post-Asia crisis, financial crisis, to the mood change among some of the public towards globalization, and of course there was the time in Seattle in 1999.
Seattle was sort of the low point, and all hell broke loose.
It was marked by tear gas and protests and so on, and a lot of people said it was almost the end of the WTO. Did it feel like that?
There was a thought that the WTO could become the League of Nations, and sidelined. I went there. I was not unbiased. I was completely biased. I wanted China into the World Trade Organization. That was my top priority. Imagine China not on a rules-based system now. Imagine if China now, every 12 months, had to get acceptance by the US Congress. Very dangerous. And of course a new trade round with development issues at their heart. I am for the little bloke. And we did both. I wanted to reform the WTO a bit too, so I didn't quite do as much there as I'd like.
But you gained a lot of respect for pushing for a new round of talks in Doha in 2001 for the trade negotiations. Now, what were you hoping to achieve at that time? What goals did you have in mind as head of the WTO?
Getting China up, rules-based system, rule of law, under a dispute settlement where we have differences, very powerful. A new trade round, putting the development issues at the centre, and it is the privilege and power of subsidies and rents and protected people in Europe and in all our countries who do best out of the old conditions.
I defined a number of moments in your career. What do you see personally as defining moments?
I think China and the WTO. If I did nothing else in my life, and really I didn't do it, by the way, maybe I saved a couple of years. You know, this is a negotiation between the partners. This is huge. To have China answerable to international laws that are predictable, to be able to take China to a dispute system. For China, for the first time in history, where the emperor is answerable to his own laws, is a very fundamental thing. And you know, people were worried about this. You know, people were scared of the power of China, and I'd be saying, listen, if you're scared of China, therefore you should have, in 1945, left Japan and Germany in ruins. A weak China is the danger. A strong China is not. Now, of course, they're having panic attacks if China's growth is slowing. It is a healthy thing that the jobs in my country and yours are based on the success of each other. We're actually not in competition.
Is there anything in your life, personally or professionally, that you haven't had a chance to do that you'd really like to tackle before, you know, you really sort of put your boots up?
In a private life, of course, there are lots of things. You know, we don't have children. That doesn't matter when you're middle-aged. It does matter as you get older.
Now, apart from the legacy you've left with the work you've done, you've also remained a very active writer. You write international newspaper columns. You've written a number of books. You still enjoy putting pen to paper?
I find it very hard. I think I'm a good researcher. I don't know if I'm a good writer. So I've got a bit of a commercial life, a little bit of university life. I spent some time with various think tanks, and well, you know, I discovered capitalism late in life, let's face it, and it's been quite good to me in one or two areas.
Mike, how would you like to be remembered? What would you like your legacy to be?
Oh, well, I've never really thought of a legacy, really. I think I'm a patriot for my country, and I think the true patriots are also internationalists. I think I'd like on my tombstone, born 1949, died 2058. That would be the legacy.
Mike, I wish you a long life. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay.